The opening day of our gospel meeting is always a day we look forward to every year, and I've certainly been looking forward to having Steve here with us. And a lot of time you ask the preacher, is there anything you'd like me to say in the introduction? I asked Steve, is there anything you don't want me to say? You're going to learn about Steve this week. I'll tell you this, I love him because I watch how he lives. Now, I listen to him preach, but I've watched how he lives. And Steve's faced some difficulties in the last few years, and I saw him face those difficulties with faith and joy and assurance. And it strengthened me. Steve, you and Kim, how you have come through this. He had some cancer issues that he'll keep struggling with, but he's overcome some of them. And I just appreciated that so much. Steve studies the Bible, and he lives the Bible. And that changes our person. And you'll see that person, a Bible person, when he speaks, because he's going to speak to us from God's Word. I also want to introduce Steve to the churches here in Warren County. And I know it's not the first time he's been here, but sometimes people find out how many churches of Christ are in this little rural county, and they say, oh no, what happened? Why can't people get along? And they don't understand it, because we do. There's about 45 churches of Christ in Warren County. And this morning, as we begin our gospel meeting with the other gospel meetings and vacation Bible schools in the area, these are the congregations already represented at this gospel meeting. Steve, we'll count you. You came from Karns, okay? That's between Knoxville and Oak Ridge, so we'll start there. But then there's Smart, West Riverside, Westwood, Bobby Branch, Central, Summitville, Rock Island, Chestnut Grove, and Rockliff. Well, that's 10. Isn't that wonderful? And it's our extended family among these sister congregations. And we love each other and support each other and rejoice as we see each other prosper. And I sometimes remind us we have this unity because we'll speak the same things. And that's how we'll maintain this unity. And so I'm going to let Steve talk now. He's preached for a number of years at Karns. That's where the School of Preaching, the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies is. I'm so glad the preachers going through there get to hear Steve preach on Sundays. What a great model for young men that are those wanting to learn how to preach, to observe how he does that and learn from him what they can. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve. But Steve, I'll tell you this. We're not here to worship Steve Higginbotham this morning. We're here to worship our Lord and Jesus Christ. And what we want Steve to do is to teach us His Word. And so that's what he'll do at this time.
Well, it's good to be with you. We really appreciate the invitation. I was speaking somewhere, and we met up with Bill and Lori, and we went to the old Philadelphia building and some cemeteries, and then we drove by here, and that's I think the first time that I'd seen the building, but I've never been here before. So what I want to do is what I always do whenever I go somewhere for the very first time, and I do it because I know people they have questions. And so that you can follow the lesson maybe and get those questions out of your head, I'm going to go ahead and give you the answers, okay? I'm 6'6", and yes, I played basketball. Can we just be done with that? Because I know people are sitting there, wow, he's tall. Wonder if he played ball. That's always what follows, the tall question. And somebody's already asked me how tall I was today. You get that. And I've been tall all my life. People say things, they'll come up to you and poke you in the ribs and say, how's the weather up there? like that's the funniest thing you have ever heard. Never heard that one before, and people say, so I have, years ago I decided to come up with a comeback to all the tall stuff. And so I was speaking in West Virginia, and there was a guy, I finished the lesson, and he got up in the pulpit before I stood down out of it. And he said to me, how tall are you anyway? Just hateful sounding. I said, I'm 6'6". And he said, I bet you played basketball. And I said, well, I did. And with that, he just turned and started to walk away. And I said, well, wait a second, how tall are you? And he said, I'm 5'4". And I said, I bet you played miniature golf. Well, he didn't do what you just did. He got a little red-faced. But, if you want to go there, I can go there with you today. I did have a lady go out the building once, and she was an elderly lady, and she said, how tall are you, young man? And I said, I'm 5 foot 18 inches. And she shook her head and said, I could have sworn you were over 6 feet. But I have a lot of fun with my height. But anyway, glad to be with you and look forward to the lessons this week. I've kind of changed the lessons that I had told Bill that I was going to preach. But I think they weren't published, so I don't think that it'll make a whole lot of difference. But I think that they'll be helpful lessons. If you have your Bible, open it to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 7. While you're turning there, let me tell you, my wife and I have different perspectives. She's here with me this week, and for many years she wasn't able to do that because we had children. And now that our children are grown, she's able to go some places with me, which I enjoy. But we see things differently. There are things like she's much more sensitive to things than I am. And we went to a movie one time, and we don't go to movies. That's been a long time ago. Hardly at all we go to movies, but there was a movie we went to once, and as the movie began, they were, how they have like the cast and the credits and all that, and it was scrolling down the screen, but then they had stuff going on in the background. It was a funeral scene in the background while all these names of the characters and the producers and all that are scrolling. And I looked over at her, and she was crying. We hadn't even gotten into the movie yet, and she was crying because of the funeral. It's still scrolling on the screen, and she's already broken up. And I once went to, did you ever see Up with your children? The little Pixar, I think, whatever it is. But it's a cartoon. I took my daughter, and that first scene in that, I could hardly hold it in. I wanted to cry, and I was like, I'm an adult, and I have my little girl with me. And I went home, and I told Kim, that is the most emotional movie I've ever seen. And she said, it's a cartoon, Steve. And I said, you go see it. And I made her go with one of our children, and of course, I got my point across. But usually we don't see things the same. She'll be touched by something that I totally miss. And there's just as that happens in our lives, a lot of us don't see like God sees. We have to work at it. We have to refine our life to conform ourselves into the image of Jesus, Romans 8 and verse 29. And we haven't done that perfectly. If we saw sin like God sees sin, we wouldn't do it. It's not worth the payoff. But we don't see it the same way. And so those temptations nag at us, and we sometimes struggle. But the root of that struggle is that we don't see like God sees. I had a teacher in college once. He's no longer living, but he taught our Greek class. And every morning we'd come into class, and the first thing he would say is, all right, put on your first century glasses. Let's get ready to do some work. And what he meant by putting on your first century glasses is, I want you to see things the way they saw things. Not just from a 21st century perspective or a 20th at that time, but I want you to go back and see things through the lens of Jesus and that period. And that's what I want you to do this morning. There's a story in Luke chapter 6 that Luke recorded for us of Jesus eating at a Pharisee's house. And I want to challenge you to see as Jesus saw in that passage. And so beginning in verse 36, read with me, and we'll go down through these verses and just make some comments. But in verse 36, then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and he sat down to eat. Now the Pharisees, most of them that we read about in the New Testament were not friends of Jesus. They were difficult. Nicodemus was an exception to that. And I'm not sure about this man or not. I think maybe this could have been an opportunity for him to test Jesus, to see what kind of, I want to sit him down and hear what he has to say. But can you imagine having Jesus come to eat at your house? When I was growing up, my dad was a gospel preacher for 60 years before he died. And during, we had, like, in our house, we had a preacher's room. Maybe you don't know what that is, but it's an upstairs bedroom that we just called the preacher's room. And it was a big bedroom, and that's where we kept all the preachers at our house that came and visited. And I really liked that as a child, because you got to hear all these preacher stories after church at night. You know, they would tell these fantastic things that happened to them. But anyway, we had this room, and Mom, before, she was an immaculate housekeeper, but when the preacher was coming, we'd do stuff like pull the refrigerator out and clean behind the refrigerator. And I remember telling her, Mom, Johnny Ramsey is not going to pull the refrigerator out and look back there to see if there's any dust on the floor. But that's the way it was. When the preacher came, we had to have everything especially clean. And I can only imagine this Pharisee having Jesus to his house. I know they didn't have homes like we have homes today, but I dare say that was special. This is this rabbi that everybody is talking about, and some claim to be a miracle worker, and this is a big deal, and I'm going to have him at my house. So this Pharisee probably has a wife or servants or, a host of people that are trying to make everything just right. As you would if Jesus were coming to your house. You would want everything to be just so. And so Jesus comes in and he sits down to eat, and behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner. Notice how she's addressed. She was a sinner. When she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with fragrant oil. Now, we can just read that, and it's just a story in the Bible. But I want you to put context to that. I want you to imagine, I want you to see it through the eyes of those people. Put on your first century glasses and try to imagine, what would that be like? Suppose you have somebody really important coming to your house and you want to impress him and you want everything just right, and some sinful woman, not just a neighbor, drops in. A sinful woman comes into the house, throws herself at the feet of this special guest, and starts crying. And then she starts kissing his feet, and her tears are dripping on his feet. And so she's taking her hair and wiping his feet. And then she breaks open this alabaster box full of fragrant oil. Have you ever gone to church, and I'm taking a risk here, but have you ever gone to church and sat down and a lady came in and it was just like, whoo, just too much? There was just like really heavy perfume. This woman must have filled their house with whatever this fragrant perfume smelled like. What would you think if you were Simon? She's making a scene. She's crying. She's down on the ground and she's wiping her hair and she's broke open and now the whole place smells. And you're trying to make a spatial impression on this very important man. I would say if there was a 911 in first century, it would have been dialed. Like, get this woman out of our house. She's not been invited. She has burst in our house and has made this huge scene. I'm thinking he's probably thinking, how do we get this woman out? After all, she wasn't the neighbor. She was a sinful woman that was recognized. Maybe she spent time in an open place where her deeds and her sinfulness was open for display. So that's the scenario. And when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know what manner of woman this is who's touching him, for she's a sinner. Twice now, the Pharisee says, if Jesus, wait, he says he's a prophet of God, and some say he's a son of God, and I know he's this rabbi that's really important, and I've had him to my meal, but if all those things were true, would he not know what kind of woman this is? Like, this is a sinful woman, and she's hanging all over his feet and touching him. Totally inappropriate. So I'm beginning to wonder whether or not he is who he claims to be. Because no self-respecting man would allow a woman like this to handle him in that fashion. And notice verse 40. And Jesus answered and said to him, by the way, Jesus answered. He answered what? What had been said? Nothing. Did you see what it said in verse 39? This Pharisee spoke to himself. He's just thinking these thoughts. Who is this guy? If he knew that she was a sinful woman, and he should know if he's a prophet, he wouldn't be letting her touch him like this. But those are just his inner thoughts. But Jesus is going to answer his inner. Jesus knows our thoughts, right? He knows not only what you say out loud, but he knows what you think and you withhold from saying. So that tells you something about, our behavior. We can't just have a feigned Christianity and check our lips when we're around certain people, but we still think the same way in an ungodly way. God knows. He sees. He can answer your thoughts. And so here's what Jesus says. Simon, that must have been that Pharisee's name. Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, well, go ahead and say it, teacher. And he said, there was a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. We don't speak in terms of denarii. Let's just put dollars for the sake of, understand. Here's a guy who owes $500 and another guy who owes $50. Okay? And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both and said, tell me, therefore, which of them loved him more? So you got two guys that owe another man money. One owes $500, the other owes him 50. And Jesus says, this guy just forgives their debt. He says, don't worry about it. We're good. Which one of those guys would love that man more? Well, Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. That's a good guess. And so Jesus said, you have rightly judged. Of course, the more you're forgiven, the greater sense of indebtedness and appreciation would certainly be there. And then he said to him, or verse 44, then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, and this is powerful. Do you see this woman? What? What kind of a question is that? Do you see this woman? Of course he saw the woman. This woman came and barged into his house uninvited and made a scene and stunk the whole place up, or at least made a smell, whether it stunk or not. You know, there's some perfume smell all through the house. Of course he saw her. Why would he even ask that? Because I think he's about to display that what Simon saw is not what he saw. And that brings us to the point of the lesson. You see, Jesus saw more than Simon saw with regard to this woman. Do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. And you didn't anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little was forgiven, the same loves little. He makes an application about that. But let's go back up and let's talk about that statement. Simon, do you see this woman? You see, Simon saw her, but I don't think he saw what Jesus saw. What he saw was a sinful woman. Twice in the text, it's brought out. She was a sinful woman. I think what Simon saw was a woman who probably wasn't invited to get water from the well in the cool of the morning. She probably had to walk at noon or evening when she had to walk all by herself because she wasn't welcomed by the other respectable ladies in town. They would walk in the cool of the morning and get the water they needed for the day and return to their home. I don't think she walked with those ladies. She was an outsider. She was a sinful woman. And she was probably, what Simon saw, was probably a woman who was considered a threat to the respectable women because of their husbands. She was a threat to their husbands and to their marriages. And they probably had scorn for her and distaste for her and what she stands for. She probably got ugly looks on the road as she maybe stood or passed by and wasn't respected. Maybe she had people knock on her door in the evening, but those same people wouldn't speak to her in the light of day. That's all that she saw, or that Simon saw. This sinful woman has burst in and ruined my party for Jesus, my supper for him, and that's it. So Jesus brings out, and there has to be a reason for saying, of course he saw her, but he didn't see her. I think Jesus saw something much different. What I think Jesus saw, well, I can illustrate it this way. When I was in college, my grandmother, my Grandma King, she developed Alzheimer's. And it got to the point where she couldn't live by herself, and we moved her into our house. And she had no cognizance at all. She talked about the farm. She grew up on a farm, and she would talk about lanterns and the barn and all these stories as if they were yesterday. And she would count to 100. she would say, someone said I couldn't count to 100. And so I showed them 1, 2, 3. And she would count and said, see, I can count to 100. And then she would count again. And she would count again. All day long, she'd count to 100. And one day I came home from college, and one of my friends came over to see me. And we were sitting there in the living room. And my grandmother would sit in this side chair. And if I had asked my friend, what do you see? Do you know what his answer would be? I see like an old lady that doesn't have anything going on mentally, who's waiting to die. That's probably all he could see. And he would be right as far as that goes. But I could look at her and I could see so much more. I could see in her kitchen this little glass jar that had a lid on it about the size where you put your whole hand down in it. And the lid was green, and she always had sugar cookies, homemade sugar cookies in it. And first thing we would do when we went to Grandma's house is I'd make a beeline to the kitchen and unscrew that lid. My sister has that jar today. Somehow, on some visit, that's going to get in my suitcase. But until that happens, it's hers right now. But I see that cookie jar. We used to go visit them like holiday time usually, and it's winter time, and they had this basement. And they had these little gas heaters, and that was the only heat there was, one gas heater in the basement. And it would get cold in that basement. And my grandmother made a gazillion quilts. And so my sister had a bed and I had a bed. And when we laid down, she'd start throwing quilts on us. So many quilts, you never get cold. You couldn't roll over for the weight of them. They held you in place. But, I think of those things. And I think of my grandmother's side table next to, my grandma and granddad had chairs in their living room, and they had a little table next to each one of their chairs, and they had worn out Bibles. And they were marked all through, underlines and all those kind of things. I remember going as a child and just sitting down and opening their Bibles just to see their notes and what they found important. You see, we were looking at the same woman, but I could see so much more than my friend could ever see. And I think that's why Jesus asked that question, do you see this woman? Because I think that what Simon saw was true, but is very short-sighted. Jesus saw so much more. He saw, yes, a sinful woman, but he saw a sinful woman that was desperate to improve her situation. You don't think she's desperate? Let me give you a challenge. On your way home today, just pick a random house on the side of the road and just go up to it, break inside, and fall down at somebody's feet and start kissing their feet. Do you know how much nerve that would take? That takes desperation for you to do that. It'd have to be an emergency situation that you would actually just burst in somebody's home and say, whatever. This woman did that, and I don't think that we put that together here. We just read the story as if it's commonplace for a woman just to break in somebody's house and interrupt. No, that's not commonplace. Imagine doing it today. Jesus saw, yes, a sinful woman, but a sinful woman who was desperate to see him. Why him? Because he can fix her desperation. She's probably sick and tired, and Jesus can probably see that she's sick and tired of being alone, of being the outcast, of not being respected by anybody in the community. She's tired of having to go to the well all by herself to draw water. She's tired of not having friends. She's tired of sin. And so she risks everything and barges into this well-planned event and throws herself at the feet of Jesus. And because of this, Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. Those who were present had trouble with that statement. They asked the question in verse 49, who is this who even forgives sins? Then he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Here's my challenge for you with this lesson. We need to put on our first century glasses. We need to start seeing people as Jesus saw people. Oh, it's easy to look at them superficially. But we need to see beyond the superficial and realize they are a soul created in the image of God who are destined for an eternal destiny either in heaven or hell. And that'll change our perspective. Have you ever known people that are just fifth wheels? They're always, oh no, don't make eye contact. They may stop and talk to you. Or oh, that's them on the phone. Don't answer the phone. We'll be there for 30 minutes, And there are people that we run from. I knew one of those people who was a fifth wheel. They tried so hard to fit in. And the more they tried, the worse they made it. You know what I'm saying? And they never quite had any friends, and people were like, oh, here she comes. Just stand there and maybe she'll keep going. Oh, good. She kept on going. That kind of an attitude. If you think they don't know what's going on, you're mistaken. She came to me one day in my office and said, I know I don't fit in. I know that as I try to be sociable and I try to have friends, and the more I try, it just drives people further away, and I don't know what to do about it. And she was broken over it. Dare we see her through the eyes of Jesus? Dare we look at people without saying, what an inconvenience they're going to be to my schedule? How socially awkward is this going to be? And start seeing them with the love and compassion of Christ. Maybe there's something there for us to take away. We can improve our vision of people. We had a man come to church that was just out of prison. And he found his place in our congregation years ago, obeyed the gospel, and he said, you know what, I went to a lot of churches after I got out of prison, and nobody would talk to me. They were all afraid of me, and they kept me at arm's distance from them. And then I came here, and I found acceptance. There were people that would actually come up to me and carry on a conversation with me. And he said, and that made the difference in me obeying the gospel and just looking again somewhere else. It was because some people decided to view them through the eyes of Jesus. We need to see our neighbors through the eyes of Jesus. We need to see our coworkers through the eyes of Jesus. We need to see our classmates through the eyes of Jesus. When we stop looking at the world with those superficial, shallow, easy marks, we can size a person up like that really quickly, can't we? We can take 5 minutes with somebody and we've got them all figured out. Jesus looked deeper than that. And he said, Simon, I know you see her, but do you see her? And apparently he didn't. But Jesus did. He saw her faith, and he brought her salvation that day. And I'm just saying that if we will challenge ourselves to get over our inconveniences and sometimes the awkwardness that comes, and sometimes the messy lives. Right now, Kim and I are studying with a woman. She's studied more than I have, but we've studied with a woman who has a really messy past. And that messy past has lifelong implications for her, consequences that's going to make her road very difficult to travel. I don't know if she's going to be able to do it or not. But I know this, if people don't see her as a soul headed for heaven or hell, she'll never make it because she'll be dismissed. There's a lot of messy things to have to deal with in her life. We've got to see people as Christ saw people. And so that's my challenge for you today. I think it's really significant that Jesus would say to this man, "Do you see this woman?" when he couldn't have missed her. Obviously, he meant more than just seeing her. He meant, do you really see her? And let's look at people in our lives with that same, through that same set of lenses, through the eyes of Jesus. And we'll find ways to make time for people. We'll find ways to be inconvenienced with them because, after all, they're souls, and heaven and hell hang in the balance with them. If you're here this morning and you're not yet a child of God, I want to encourage you to obey the gospel. Jesus said, "He who believes and is baptized shall be saved." I trust him. He'll do what he said. And if you're here already having obeyed the gospel, but maybe there are changes that you need to make in your life, we'll pray with you to that end if you'll come as we stand together and sing.